Otis Redding, the 26-year-old king of soul whose voice could transform human suffering into sacred healing, found dead beneath the frozen surface of Lake Monona, Wisconsin, on December 10, 1967. The man who sang about sitting on the dock of the bay watching the tide roll away was swallowed by dark waters that showed no mercy to dreams, talent, or the incomplete symphonies still echoing in his mind. The death certificate would read, "Accidental drowning following aircraft crash." But the real tragedy was a universe that allows transcendent genius to burn so briefly before extinguishing it in the cruel mathematics of weather, altitude, and fate. The contradiction was devastating in its completeness. Here was a voice that had served as sanctuary for millions, a sacred space where pain became prayer and loneliness transformed into communion. Yet that same voice now lay silenced beneath icy waters, the dock replaced by depth, the sanctuary consumed by silence. The briefcase floating beside his body contained sketches for songs that would never be finished. Melodies that died with him in the merciless cold of a Midwestern lake. But this was not a story that began with twisted metal and freezing water. This was a story that began in the red dirt of Georgia, in a sharecropper's house where music was both salvation and survival, where a child learned to build bridges between the sacred and secular worlds. The death certificate would read, "Accidental drowning following aircraft crash." But the real tragedy was a universe that allows transcendent genius to burn so briefly before extinguishing it in the cruel mathematics of weather, altitude, and fate. In the cotton fields of Dawson, Georgia, Otis Ray Redding Jr. entered the world on September 9, 1941, born into a family where every penny mattered but music mattered more. His father, Otis Sr., worked whatever jobs the Jim Crow South would allow, sharecropping, well digging, lumber hauling, while his mother, Fannie Mae, raised 6 children in a house where gospel records wore thin from constant play, and Sunday morning meant the sanctuary of Vineville Baptist Church. The Redding household was poor in everything except faith and rhythm. Young Otis discovered his gift in that small church where call and response was not just musical technique but spiritual technology, a way to transform individual pain into collective healing. Even at 5 years old, there was something otherworldly about the sounds that emerged from his throat, as if generations of accumulated suffering and joy had found their voice in this sharecropper's son. But it was the secular music that truly captured his imagination. Late at night, when his parents thought he was sleeping, Otis would tune the family radio to distant stations broadcasting rhythm and blues from cities that seemed as far away as heaven. He heard Little Richard's holy wildness, Sam Cooke's silky sophistication, and Ray Charles's perfect fusion of Saturday night sin and Sunday morning salvation. These voices taught him that music could serve as a bridge between the sacred and secular worlds, that you could carry church into the juke joint and bring blues into the sanctuary. His first public performance came at a school talent show when he was 12, singing a gospel number that moved the audience to tears and made him understand that his voice was not just entertainment, but ministry. Teachers and classmates who had known him only as the quiet, poor boy suddenly saw him differently. Here was someone touched by something larger than circumstance, someone whose gift transcended the limitations of rural Georgia poverty. The sacred secular bridge was being built note by note as Otis learned to channel the call and response techniques of Baptist worship into the emerging language of soul music. His voice carried the accumulated wisdom of gospel tradition while remaining completely personal and immediate, transforming simple lyrics into profound statements about the human condition. The transformation from church singer to professional performer wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. By 15, Otis had formed his first band, the Pine Toppers, and was playing juke joints and high school dances throughout central Georgia. The money was minimal, but the response was overwhelming. Audiences who had never heard anything like his voice were transfixed by the way he could take them from whispered intimacy to explosive release within a single song. "If you don't try, you'll never know what you can do." Words that became his personal motto during those teenage years when he began entering every talent contest within driving distance, sometimes walking miles to reach venues that offered prize money his family desperately needed. Each performance was an act of faith, of a belief that authentic emotion could transcend the racial and economic barriers that defined life in the Jim Crow South. His high school years were marked by the constant tension between education and necessity. When he was forced to drop out in 10th grade to help support his siblings, it felt like the death of one dream in service of family responsibility. But even while working construction and pumping gas during the day, Otis continued performing at night, slowly building a reputation throughout Georgia's club circuit as someone whose voice could make you feel like you were the only person in the room. These were the years that forged his understanding of music as work song, not some mystical gift that fell from heaven, but labor that required dedication, craft, and the willingness to sacrifice everything else for the chance to connect with audiences who needed what he could give them. He learned to sing hard the same way his father worked hard, with the understanding that authenticity required effort and excellence demanded suffering. The early 1960s found Otis driving throughout the South in whatever vehicles the band could afford, sleeping in cars when hotels wouldn't accept black performers, surviving on gas station snacks and the occasional kindness of fans who offered meals and shelter. The stage alternated with soil. One night performing in Memphis clubs, the next day back home working his family's small farm, both experiences feeding his soul in different ways. His breakthrough came through persistence and divine intervention. In 1962, he drove to Memphis with his band to record backup vocals for another artist at Stax Records. When the session ended early, Otis asked if he could record something of his own. The song he laid down in that impromptu session was "These Arms of Mine," and it announced the arrival of a voice that would redefine what popular music could accomplish. The magic that happened in that Stax studio represented more than just a recording session. It was the birth of a new kind of artistic community. The integrated house band at Stax, featuring both black and white musicians, created an environment where racial barriers dissolved in service of something larger than any individual's background or prejudices. Here was proof that music could serve as the sacred secular bridge Otis had been building his entire life. His collaboration with guitarist Steve Cropper became one of the most productive partnerships in music history. Cropper understood that Otis's voice was the instrument around which everything else should be arranged, crafting musical settings that highlighted rather than competed with the emotional intensity of the vocals. Together, they created a sound that was both timeless and thoroughly contemporary, rooted in gospel tradition but speaking directly to the present moment. The songs that emerged from this partnership, Mr. Pitiful, I've Been Loving You Too Long, Try a Little Tenderness, established a new template for soul music. Simple lyrics transformed into complex emotional statements through the power of authentic performance. Otis had learned to inhabit songs so completely that listeners felt they were experiencing his emotions firsthand, as if his voice was simultaneously confession and absolution. I love hard, I work hard, and I sing hard. Philosophy that guided Otis through the complex negotiations of early fame, as he learned to balance artistic integrity with commercial necessity. He refused to soften his sound to appeal to white radio programmers, insisting that authentic emotion would eventually find its audience regardless of racial boundaries. This wasn't naive optimism, but hard-earned wisdom. He had seen how the sacred secular bridge could unite audiences across every division that society tried to impose. But even as his artistic reputation grew, Otis remained grounded in the rural Georgia values that had shaped his character. Success hadn't changed his fundamental understanding that the stage and soil were both necessary for his spiritual survival. He purchased a farm in Round Oak, Georgia, where he could escape the pressures of fame and reconnect with the agricultural rhythms that had nurtured his earliest dreams. The farm represented everything that music had given him: financial security for his family, a place where he could be Otis Ray rather than Otis Redding, and a connection to the land that had nurtured his voice. He raised cattle, grew crops, and found in farming the same satisfaction that others might derive from hobbies or vacations. The amplifier's roar and the tractor's rumble both fed his soul, reminding him that authentic power came from understanding your roots even as you reached for transcendence. All I ever wanted was to sing to the people, words that captured the essential simplicity of his ambition, even as that singing brought increasingly complex responsibilities and opportunities. By 1966, Otis had become one of the most respected voices in soul music, but he remained fundamentally unchanged by success, still the same person who had sung in church choirs and worked the red Georgia soil with his bare hands. The Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967 marked Otis's triumphant breakthrough to white audiences, a performance that introduced him to the counterculture movement and proved that authentic soul music could transcend every boundary that society tried to impose. His set that afternoon was nothing less than a mass baptism, a demonstration that the sacred secular bridge could unite audiences regardless of their background, politics, or previous musical preferences. The predominantly white hippie audience had never seen anything like Otis Redding's performance. Here was someone who could transform a simple song like "Try a Little Tenderness" into a religious experience, building from gentle crooning to explosive release while commanding the stage with physical presence that was both graceful and powerfully masculine. Grown men wept openly, women screamed themselves hoarse, and the standing ovation that followed lasted for nearly 10 minutes. All barriers dissolved in the face of emotional truth so pure it couldn't be denied or categorized. But perhaps more significant than the audience response was the effect the performance had on Otis himself. For the first time, he had experienced the possibility of universal connection, of speaking to human experiences that transcended racial categories entirely. The success at Monterey opened doors that had previously been closed, creating opportunities for the kind of widespread recognition that had always seemed just out of reach. The months following Monterey were marked by intense creative activity as Otis worked to capitalize on his newfound crossover appeal while deepening his artistic vision. He began collaborating with a wider range of musicians, exploring how the sacred secular bridge might extend into different genres and cultural contexts. His sessions during this period included experiments with psychedelic rock elements, jazz-influenced arrangements, and even early explorations of what would later become funk music. But perhaps most significantly, Otis began writing more introspective material that reflected his growing understanding of his role as both entertainer and spiritual guide. The rough sketches found in his briefcase after the crash included song fragments that suggested an artist ready to tackle more complex themes: racial reconciliation, spiritual searching, the relationship between individual success and community responsibility. These were mature works from someone who had moved beyond simple entertainment toward genuine artistic statement. One particularly revealing piece from this period, discovered years later among his papers, showed Otis grappling with the weight of his expanding influence. They come to hear me sing, but they leave with something else: hope, maybe, or just the feeling that someone understands their pain. That's a bigger responsibility than I ever imagined when I first stepped on stage. Every night I'm not just performing songs, I'm trying to heal wounds I can't even see. His relationship with younger artists became increasingly important during this period, as he understood that his success created opportunities to lift others who might not otherwise receive recognition. He began insisting that his recording sessions include backing vocalists and musicians from the local community, turning every project into a training ground for emerging talent. The sacred secular bridge became not just an artistic philosophy but a practical approach to creating opportunities for others. The creative intensity of this period also revealed new depths in his collaboration with Steve Cropper and the Stax rhythm section. Their musical conversations had evolved to the point where entire songs could be developed through improvisation, with each musician contributing ideas that built organically into fully realized compositions. These sessions produced some of the most sophisticated arrangements in soul music history, compositions that balance technical complexity with emotional directness. During one particularly memorable session in November 1967, just weeks before his death, Otis and the band worked on a song tentatively titled Love Man that pushed the boundaries of traditional soul music into new territory. The arrangement incorporated elements of gospel, blues, jazz, and early funk, creating a sound that was simultaneously rooted in tradition and completely innovative. Those who heard the rough mixes described it as potentially revolutionary, a glimpse of where soul music might evolve under Otis's continued leadership. But it was the sessions for Sittin On, the Dock of the Bay that revealed the full extent of his artistic evolution. Unlike his previous recordings, which had been characterized by explosive energy and emotional intensity, this song embraced stillness and contemplation. The decision to include whistling in place of a final verse wasn't just an improvised solution. It was a philosophical statement about the value of silence, the importance of space in both music and life. Cropper later described the recording session as unlike anything they had experienced together. Otis was in a completely different headspace. Usually he would come into the studio with enormous energy, ready to attack the song like he was trying to convert the world. But with Dock of the Bay, he was almost meditative. He kept talking about watching time pass, about finding peace in just observing life instead of always trying to change it. The song's innovative production techniques reflected Otis's growing sophistication as both artist and philosopher. The use of seagull sounds and waves wasn't just atmospheric decoration but served to blur the boundaries between performance and environment, between the artificial space of the recording studio and the natural world that had always nourished his creativity. The sacred secular bridge was extending into new territory, connecting not just different musical traditions but different ways of experiencing reality itself. This is the one. This is the song that will change everything, words that proved prophetic in ways he could never have imagined. The track represented a synthesis of everything he had learned about music, spirituality, and the human condition. A mature statement from an artist who was just beginning to understand the full scope of his powers. But it also served as an inadvertent farewell, a meditation on solitude and searching that would take on tragic resonance after his death. The philosophical depth of Dock of the Bay reflected Otis's growing awareness of his mortality and his desire to create something that would outlast his physical presence. In conversations with friends during this period, he spoke increasingly about legacy and lasting impact, as if he understood that his time might be limited. The tide and time that he sang about weren't just poetic images, but reflections on the fundamental rhythms of existence, the way life flows like water, carrying away dreams and delivering new possibilities with each cycle. Sittin On. The Dock of the Bay, recorded just 3 days before his death, represented the culmination of this artistic evolution. The song combined the emotional directness that had always characterized his work with a new level of introspection and musical sophistication. It was simultaneously his most personal and most universal statement, a meditation on solitude and searching that dissolved the boundaries between sacred and secular, black and white, individual and collective experience. This is the one. This is the song that will change everything. Words he spoke to producer Steve Cropper after recording the basic track, as if he understood that he had created something transcendent. The song's innovative use of whistling and sound effects, its philosophical lyrics about watching life pass by, and its gentle tide-like rhythm marked a new direction for an artist who was constantly evolving, constantly pushing against the limitations that others tried to impose on his vision. The whistling that concludes the song, added at the last minute because Otis hadn't finished writing the final verse, became one of the most haunting sounds in popular music. Like the spaces between words in a poem, it suggested everything that remained unsaid, all the songs he would never complete, all the bridges he would never finish building between the sacred and secular worlds. But even as he reached new creative heights, those closest to Otis noticed a change in his demeanor during his final months. The man who had always been gregarious and optimistic seemed more contemplative, as if he were processing experiences and emotions that he had never had time to fully examine. Friends attributed it to maturity and artistic growth, but in retrospect it felt like someone preparing for a transition he couldn't yet name, like the tide pulling back before the final wave. The decision to charter a private plane for the December 1967 tour was motivated by practical necessity rather than rock star luxury. Otis's schedule had become increasingly demanding, with back-to-back performances that made commercial flights impossible to coordinate. The Beechcraft H-18 seemed like a reasonable solution, a reliable aircraft that had served other musicians well, operated by an experienced pilot who understood the unique demands of touring. But the winter of 1967 had been particularly brutal in the Midwest, with weather systems that challenged even the most experienced aviators. The flight from Cleveland to Madison had been delayed several times due to deteriorating conditions, and friends had urged Otis to consider canceling the show rather than risking the journey. But he had never missed a performance due to weather, and the audience in Madison was expecting him. His dedication to the people who needed his music overrode every practical consideration. The last people to see him alive described someone who seemed unusually thoughtful, as if he were carrying the weight of unfinished business or unexpressed thoughts. He spent extra time on the phone with his wife Zelma that morning, telling her he loved her with an intensity that surprised even band members who had grown accustomed to his emotional directness. There was something in his voice, a finality that felt more like goodbye than see you soon. The flight took off from Cleveland on the afternoon of December 10th, carrying Otis and 4 members of his backing band, the Briefcase, toward what should have been just another show in a career filled with triumph and growing recognition. Instead, they flew into weather that would prove too much for the aging aircraft, into visibility conditions that made navigation nearly impossible, into the cruel mathematics of altitude and atmospheric pressure that care nothing for genius or dreams. The final moments of Flight N390OT remain shrouded in the mysteries of mechanical failure and human limitation. What is known is that the plane began descending too rapidly as it approached Madison, that the pilot struggled to maintain control in conditions that would have challenged much newer aircraft, and that the impact with Lake Monona's surface ended 6 lives and silenced one of the most powerful voices in American music history. When rescue workers finally reached the wreckage, they found Otis's body floating near the aircraft, still wearing the leather jacket that had become his trademark. His briefcase, containing lyrics and musical ideas for future projects, was recovered intact, a treasure trove of unrealized potential that offered glimpses of where his artistry might have evolved. The dock had become depth, the sanctuary had become silence, and the tide that he sang about watching had finally carried him away. The death certificate would read accidental drowning following aircraft crash. But the real tragedy was a universe that allows transcendent genius to burn so briefly before extinguishing it in the cruel mathematics of weather, altitude, and fate. The news of Otis's death sent shockwaves through the music industry and beyond, as artists and fans struggled to comprehend the loss of someone who had seemed destined for decades of continued growth and influence. Radio stations began playing his music in marathon tributes, and record stores couldn't keep his albums in stock as grieving listeners sought comfort in the voice that would never speak to them again. The funeral in Macon became a pilgrimage site for musicians and fans who had been touched by his art. Jerry Wexler, Aretha Franklin, and dozens of other soul music luminaries came to pay their respects to an artist who had influenced them all. But perhaps the most moving tributes came from ordinary people, sharecroppers and factory workers and domestic workers who had seen their own struggles reflected in his songs and found in his voice a dignity that the world often denied them. These were the people who understood that Otis had never been just an entertainer, but a translator of pain into hope, a builder of bridges between the sacred and secular worlds that offered refuge to anyone who needed healing. They came not to mourn a celebrity, but to honor someone who had carried their stories to stages they would never see, who had made their experiences matter in a world that often treated them as invisible. Sittin On. The Dock of the Bay was released posthumously and became Otis's first #1 hit, a bitter irony that highlighted how much promise had been lost. The song's success proved that he had been on the verge of the mainstream breakthrough that had eluded him during his lifetime, that his evolution as an artist was far from complete when death intervened. This is the one, prophetic words that proved tragically accurate as the song became his memorial and his masterpiece simultaneously. But the commercial success felt hollow compared to what might have been. Industry insiders spoke of the albums he would never record, the collaborations that would never happen, the influence he would never have on the next generation of artists. His death at 26 meant that the world had received only a preview of his greatness rather than its full flowering, like a cathedral left half-built or a symphony interrupted in the middle of its most beautiful movement. The recording industry's response to his death followed familiar patterns: rush-released compilation albums, hastily assembled tribute concerts, and the commercial exploitation of grief that transforms tragedy into product. Record companies that had sometimes been reluctant to promote his music during his lifetime now competed to claim association with his legacy, as if death had somehow made him safer for mass consumption. But beneath the commercial machinery lay genuine mourning for an artist who had managed to remain authentic in an industry that often demanded compromise. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Otis had never softened his sound for crossover appeal, never allowed commercial considerations to override artistic integrity. His death meant the loss of someone who proved that the sacred secular bridge could support authentic expression while achieving commercial success. The farm in Round Oak became a shrine of sorts, visited by musicians and fans who wanted to understand the man behind the voice. The cattle he had raised continued to graze the fields he had loved, while the house he had built for his family stood as testimony to the simple dreams that had motivated his ambition. Here was where the stage and soil had intersected, where Otis the person had been most himself. Away from the demands of performance and the pressures of fame, his influence on subsequent generations of musicians has been immeasurable, with artists from Mick Jagger to Bruce Springsteen citing him as a primary influence. But more than his impact on other performers, Otis's legacy lies in his demonstration that popular music could carry profound emotional and spiritual weight, that entertainment and transcendence were not mutually exclusive categories. The tragedy of his death extends beyond the loss of future music to encompass all the ways he might have continued to build bridges between divided communities, to heal wounds that still fester in American society. At 26, he was just beginning to explore the full range of his creative possibilities, just starting to understand how his voice might serve not only entertainment, but also social and spiritual healing. Today, when young singers attempt to capture the power and authenticity that defined his work, they discover how rare his combination of technical skill, emotional honesty, and spiritual depth actually was. Otis Redding wasn't just a great singer. He was someone who understood that music could serve as a sacred secular bridge, connecting individual expression with communal experience, transforming personal pain into collective healing. The cold waters of Lake Monona claimed more than just a life. They claimed a future that might have transformed American culture in ways we can only imagine. The dock had become depth, the sanctuary had become silence, but the voice that was silenced that December afternoon continues to speak through the recordings he left behind, offering testament to the possibility of authentic expression in a world that often values pretense over truth. The tide and time that he sang about in his final song continue their eternal dance, carrying away dreams and delivering new possibilities with each cycle. But some losses are too great for the natural rhythms of healing to address, some silences too profound for even the most powerful music to fill completely. If you don't try, you'll never know what you can do. Words that defined his approach to both music and life, and which serve as his final challenge to those who would follow in his path. The death certificate read, "Accidental drowning following aircraft crash." But you decide, will you call this tragic accident or cosmic injustice? If the universe had allowed him more time, how much further might his sacred secular bridge have extended? How many more souls might he have carried from pain to healing? Remember the voice and the vision, not just the recordings they left behind. The plane crash only put the period at the end. The song had been written in the red dirt of Georgia, in the churches and juke joints of the South, in the dreams of a sharecropper's son who believed that music could transform the world. I love hard, I work hard, and I sing hard. The real tragedy was a universe that allows transcendent genius to burn so briefly before extinguishing it. In the cruel mathematics of weather, altitude, and fate, and until we acknowledge that some losses diminish us all, Otis Redding's death remains not a closed chapter but an ongoing reminder of how quickly sanctuary can become silence, how easily the dock can become depth,